Greetings, all, and welcome. Today I'm joined by Darian, also known as D on the social media, and at Royal Fool, I believe, is the handle that you often go by, Darian, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
And so you can find Darian on the social media at that handle. So Darian and I have had some exchanges on the social media. I've read some of his work on Substack, and I'm fascinated by his thought. He covers a lot of ground in a lot of very interesting ways. So I thought I'd invite him on and have a conversation with him. So, with that, Darian, it's great to have you. Thanks so much for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
It's my pleasure. To begin with, why don't you just give a brief introduction about yourself? Tell our viewers a little bit about who you are, what you do, and what your interests are.
I'm Darian, 24. I study a lot, and I write about it. I started with psychology and sort of went through the classical education route to basically perfect myself in a way that I noticed people around me were not doing. They were going through standard education and they were just not achieving anything um, in any way except at a social level.
That's interesting. Could you say more about that? They weren't achieving anything except at a social level. What do you mean by that?
Well, they were only achieving symbols of value that were given to them by human agents. Like there was no, they couldn't do anything. It was just they were rewarded for playing the game.
There's a lot of that that goes on nowadays. So
Yeah.
psychology and education, those are, I think, fundamental studies. And it's interesting because, on the one hand, I mean, psychology kind of takes us into questions of personhood and identity, and education is much more of a social thing. So it kind of covers like the interior ground and then the exterior ground on the social level. Um, what led you to begin with psychology? And I'll throw this out there. This is a quote from one of your pieces on your Substack. I find the most important things about people is to notice their patterns, and I suspect that there's probably something related to psychology in this. So I'm really curious. What brought you to psychology? What is it that interests you about human patterns?
Well, I was interested first in politics because I got social reward for being adept in understanding political currents. But then I realized no one well, very few people in politics have any comprehension of themselves. So they're acting in an external polis, but they do not have awareness of their inner city, and it became very um, disheartening to see everyone behaving, going about their thoughts in a way which had no introspection. It was just I do this, I get reward, and they were just they were trained like dogs to perform, and they had no authenticity. The way that relates to patterns is just finding those complex undercurrents because we're not constant, but we have patterns which are consistent. And if you're able to keep track of those, you're able to see a clearer image than if you have a materialist reduction of a hard set thing. But if you're able to see a fluid pattern, then you're actually seeing a living entity.
Fluid patterns, that sounds like a very elusive thing. Now, one of the things that strikes me about your way of approaching ideas, Darian, is that it's not the classical kind of logic chopping approach where you're going to try to pin everything down and put a label underneath it and then get it settled that way. You definitely have a strong logical capacity which comes through, but there's also a way in which you're open to that kind of elusiveness in the world. I mean, there's a way in which the world kind of evades us when we try to get our fingers around it. It just kind of slips through.
Yeah.
And you have a very interesting approach that allows you to kind of navigate that. So I'm curious about that. Tell me a little bit more about that aspect of your thought.
I was more scientifically minded when I was younger. I was more of a materialist. I wandered into atheism. I found myself there for quite a while.
You and me both. Yeah.
And then slowly through a variety of studies and also doing psychedelics, which just blew my brain open, um, I found that you can't you can't grab hold of the things that matter, and they are this elusive water that if you grasp too firmly, they disappear. And a lot of the academic and overly logical rigor that we have crushes the meaning out of things. And I just found, just through other people saying this and my own experience, that you can't try to pin everything down or it runs away. If we were to treat even ideas and things we think of as dead as alive, and you treat them with a sort of, it's a different kind of respect, but it is still a respect, then they help you.
Yeah, there almost seems to be something playful about the world as world, right? It's something that kind
Yeah.
of evades us. I mean, it's tempting to say that it does so intentionally, but I think that might be going too far. Maybe I'm not sure. But nonetheless, there's a way in which our reason is capable of gathering just enough information and establishing just enough rigorous systems around the world that we can kind of manipulate things and give ourselves a sense of power, but not quite enough to get to the real root of things. And I think that meaning is one of the major components of what simple scientific style logic just can't get at. And it's a curious thing because it's kind of built on meaning, right? You can't get away from meaning, even if you have a scientific bent or a scientific mindset. You hide it, you bury it very effectively, but it's under there, right?
You know, uh, that burying has been just detrimental to society. I think, if our education systems were oriented around this, I mean, I see that as the logos, as the orienting point. Um, there is that central axis of meaning, which if you do everything with that in mind, becomes full of light, essentially.
It seems to demand a different kind of approach, though. I mean, it's strange because in a certain sense, I'm kind of tempted to try to give like rational labeling to all of this to try to say, so what is it exactly that allows us to perceive that meaning? Is it intuition? Is it some kind of divinization? Is it something that comes into our minds from a higher source and touches our consciousness with rays of light that lets us perceive all that illumines the path before us? And I think that to an extent we can do that. To an extent, it's almost just like a capacity that we have that we kind of have to accept as what it is and just kind of go with it. But what would you say about that? And if we do have to just accept that capacity, would that be equivalent to something like faith, or what would you say about that?
The left brain seems to narrate, or I'll say left brain. The left brain narrates everything that you intuitively know. Um, I've read I've not finished, but have been inspired by Ian McGilchrist's work and his Master and His Emissary, and his understandings of the left and right brain, um, and that our society is overwhelmingly left brain oriented, of reducing things down to their fine into atoms, basically. But there's a whole other operating system which is, you could say, in tune with nature. And if you're able to access that and not just reduce things down into parts, um, you're actually able to commune with the source of everything and not just see the the opposite end of the spectrum, which is the tiny, the individuated.
Yeah, this reminds me of, I think it was Pascal, and if I'm remembering correctly, he divided human thought into the geometric thinking and then the intuitive thinking. It's been a long time since I've read Pascal, probably too long since I've read Pascal, but that division seems to me at least a very effective shorthand for trying to understand what's going on here. And I think you're right. Particularly in our contemporary societies, there seems to be a sort of reductionist, materialistic, scientistic attitude which tends to press us in the direction of attempting to rationalize the world down to its finest parts and to mathematize the world in a way which, again, can be very effective and very powerful, but misses a lot. There's also sort of a reaction to that, which kind of goes maybe too far in the other direction, where you just kind of eliminate completely the rational side and you just kind of want to ignore the existence of that altogether and try to focus on the intuitive to the point that you're kind of just floating through life. I think a lot of people who go that way tend to just sort of float through life. And it seems almost as if we need to find some kind of a balance. And I imagine that this is probably one of the great challenges of education in particular, trying to find a way of instilling that balance in the young, right? So that they don't have this kind of imbalanced, and they don't end up uh, either going down the route of extreme logicism or, on the other hand, rebelling against it to the point that they lose themselves completely.
I think a lot of holistic paths or cultures, which I think there were cultures which understood this, and I think we are refining Western culture to be able to understand this now. Um, that we have this dual nature of I just see it as a black and a white sphere, and then the overlapping middle. And the right course of action is to center yourself in that middle, so that you're able to logically analyze and have this piercing awareness, but you also have this broad, open awareness. I see it sort of as a sphere, and or, well, in magic they have the squaring of the circle. You have the sphere and the square, or the sphere and the line, um, and these just seem to be the masculine, feminine, polar attributes of everything. It's not just a facet of our direct experience and our um, how our brains work, but everything has this in it. And I think through I think what we're going through right now with AI and computation is an offshoot of this left brain capacity. We're sort of offloading it into an external agency so that we can perhaps focus inwardly more on this right brain intuitive, uh, more feminine aspect. Um, this may develop into something entirely different once we do that, but as of now, I think we are offloading what we've spent the past, like since it's science. I think we're offloading that so that we can focus on other aspects of the body.
That is a fascinating suggestion. That's a different way of articulating the problem than I've heard, and certainly than I was articulating the problem to myself. But I think I was coming to similar ideas in terms of the arts, for example, or in terms of human endeavor more broadly understood, that artificial intelligence tends to be able to very effectively reproduce and, in many cases, substitute human beings in their kind of technical capacity, their ability to just like mechanically do things or mechanically think through things. And that opens up a certain kind of liberty, but it's a very high level liberty, right? It's a sort of, it's kind of like all the mid range things get knocked out. There's sort of certain manual jobs which I think it would be very difficult for machines to replace, at least at the present level of development. And then there are the high level things that would be very difficult for machines to substitute. But the sort of the mid range gets knocked out. And the way that you put that seems very, very right to me. I like this idea of offloading our kind of logical capacity onto machines, because machines are logical machines, right? They're built on like a structure and a basis of logic.
It's like the Industrial Revolution for mentation, for the mental processes. So we're going to be able to jump farther without as much energy expenditure in the mental realm, just by having automata which do that aspect for us.
And I mean, I think that there are a lot of ways in which we're going to have to struggle with some of the negative consequences of that. You seem optimistic from the description you've just given us.
I don't. I don't know any other way to be, really. It's just, what's the point in being any other way?
Yes, I mean, I suppose, yeah, right, definitely. If the alternatives really are optimist or pessimist, then anyone who decides to be a pessimist probably should rethink that particular decision. Um, but I mean, I guess there is some value to seeing the problems that we're facing and to try to understand the full ramifications of those problems. And I know that you've done this in many of the things that you've written, some of the pieces that you dedicated to kind of like a social analysis, an analysis of our society and how it could be improved. There's definitely a way in which you see these difficulties, and you're trying to address those various aspects. Um, but I mean, say a bit more about this in particular. It seems to be what you just said, that you're seeing artificial intelligence as potentially providing an opportunity for us to explore these other kind of forgotten or half forgotten parts of our mentation, parts of our being. Does that sound right?
Yeah. Um,
It was a very tentative yeah.
Mhm. Well, one of the ways I feel that I'm able to see problems more clearly because I enjoy them. Like I do not see it as a bad thing. So I'm like good. There's problems. I get something to do. Um, that's just sort of it's a very intellectually aggressive character. I see AI doing a lot of the background and cleanup work in our mind, storing information. I've had a vision or like that sense that science fiction writers have where they see the future basically. Um, we're going to get rid of phones and tablets and things like this. We're likely going to have augmented reality type experiences which connect into hubs like we won't have PCs as the way they are, but they will be hubs which connect to whatever we're wearing as though it were a phone, maybe glasses, maybe a little electrode we have on the head. Who knows what it'll be? Um, Preferably non-invasive. I would prefer there be no mass neural linking.
I would too.
Um, those smaller uh, user systems will piggyback off of local systems to amplify them, just amplifiers. And then we'll be living we're slowly materializing to where the dullest people can see the spiritual realm. When I say the psychic realm, psyche, the soul realm, the inner experience world is becoming projected outward, so that even those who cannot see inside themselves can see what others have found inside themselves.
Hmm.
This may not grant them the ability to do that themselves, but you can simulate it, and then the more intelligent people will just absorb that um, indirectly. I mean, if you ever watched anything, if you ever seen anything beautiful and it was made by a person, you wonder who made that. Even if you see something that was, naturally beautiful, you ask who made that, and then you get into religious
Right, right.
dialogue. But yeah, so that'll clean up a lot of things. Just not having to remember, or like not having to expend so much energy into the refinement of baseline human intelligences. That will free a lot of bandwidth for essentially higher dimensional tasks, thinking in ways which are not mathematical and survival.
So I'd like to come back to this analogy you've made between what's happening presently and the Industrial Revolution. And I think that it's a very fair analogy. There's a lot of truth to it. One of the major differences I see is that the Industrial Revolution did not substitute the need for bodily strength. Right? It made certain jobs completely obsolete. Right? It took the place of a great many positions of manual labor, but it wasn't as if it went through humanity and just made certain muscle groups completely superfluous or something like that. Right? Um, the present technological revolution, on the other hand, seems to be a bit more invasive in that regard because it really does, in a certain way, allow us to let parts of ourselves atrophy in a way that I don't think we've seen quite ever before.
Yeah, there will probably be brains in jars, just people who are completely giving themselves over.
Yeah, yeah, right, exactly. I think that one of the very fun, probable inevitabilities of our near future. But um, I mean, yeah, memory. You mentioned memory, for example, and I'm definitely cognizant of the fact that my own memory, which is already weak to begin with, has definitely not had much service done to it by the new technologies. And I think that's probably kind of a generalized thing. So, I mean, the more advanced these technologies get and the more they're able to kind of take the place of our thinking for us, one of the real problems I see with that is that there's a tendency to use that as a crutch and to not develop certain faculties that before in prior times we had to develop. So I guess that might demand, on the one hand, very conscious effort in the other direction. Like you just have to train your memory very deliberately in order to stop that sort of thing from happening. But again, this comes very much down to the problem of education. Education, both in terms of the education of the very young and also self education, right? What it means to try to discipline ourselves in the world that we're living in. What are your thoughts on that, Darian?
Well, I think what we should be devoting AI to is trainers for people, in every regard, really. If you have a like, you can have a physical trainer, like someone who an AI model trained on physical training data, just knowing what your body type is, how your muscles move, where your bones are positioned, to know how to most efficiently exercise. You can do the same thing for every neurotype for their education. So we're very likely going to have self-tuned, basically guardian angels, which act as professors, which we sort of have a constant dialogue with, um, which we have to make things very open source and transparent before then, so that no one is fiddling with these. Um, because I think we've seen enough of that in the social media generations. We need to have we need people to fail on their own. They don't need help with that.
Yeah, I mean, when I think about ChatGPT, for example, this is obviously a very, very early example of the sort of thing that we're talking about, and it's still in its infancy. It's still in its infancy, both in terms of the technology and in terms of the social reaction to the technology and the way that we're learning how to coexist with these novelties. But it does occur to me that there's less dialogue that goes on there than reliance, right? It's not like you go there to talk with ChatGTP necessarily. When you go there to like figure out what it can tell you about whatever question you have, and it's very unidirectional, I guess is the way that I'd put it, right? It's kind of like I want this, and it's going to give me this, and I'm going to use that in lieu of any like necessity to rely on my memory or my ability to find this information independently. And that sort of dynamic troubles me. But
I think that right now we're just being user data to understand how AI works,
hmm,
and there's not there's not much value in it. There's value in it as training data for its own ends and our relationship to it. So we're just learning how we're meeting an alien species that we made, and we're watching it grow up and trying to perform eugenics real time on it.
right.
And it's a very strange, well, it's the first dynamic of this kind that we've had, so it's not, I mean, it's as strange as it can be.
Kind of flies between the amusing and the horrifying, doesn't it?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, that's what fun is, really. It's just the, but the reliance is there. But I mean, there's a vast majority of people will be reliant no matter what they're given. Anything, they'll find something to latch onto. People are fond of hero worship. They'll find something to latch onto. Um, this can be good, like a boat to get over a hardship, but just like a drug, it becomes ritualized abuse that the person does, and they just do not. They begin to atrophy. They do not develop. I don't know why. Maybe they just don't have that willpower or drive, and they need someone to step in and do this for them. Um, I know that at times I would have liked if someone did that for me,
Right.
but it's usually you just find yourself falling further and further and further, and then you have to like scramble to regrow those limbs.
Yeah, this is a curious psychological question. What is it that propels some human beings to kind of resist that, and other human beings to just fall into it? And I don't know how to answer that question. I mean, there are a lot of variables in between, and different individualities that respond in different ways. But on the whole, just as kind of like a rule, what causes that kind of a thing? And I don't know. I don't know about that.
Well, I think we need to start thinking multi-generationally and in ecosystems. So we can't sustain the individual anymore. Like that idea doesn't work. Um, it's purely a legal mechanic. It doesn't have anything other than blame reward to it. Um, I don't believe that it has any like metaphysical basis. Uh, what does have metaphysical basis is some sort of like soul, but that soul is always in communion with other things. So there's never an atomic man who just is without influence. You have to take into consideration the entirety of the past up till now, his bloodline, his his family systems, the friends he met, all these things. And I think people who are more intelligent while partnered with better education, they're just aware of this. If you grow up in the system which expects and rewards intelligence and you are intelligent, then you just naturally understand these things about the world, that there are subtle connective tissues between all of these things. You can't really pin them down, but you know that they affect you deeply. Like focusing on or bringing clarity to these subtle forces which direct everything in our lives uh, will be essential, especially for education or just culture, memetics. It's just like genetics, but different. It, it's just the same processes of good mutation, bad mutation, good idea, bad idea. They're not terribly different. You can abstract out the similar functions between them, and that's one of the patterns that's important. Just knowing how to gamble with memes and genes in order to get ahead, to not go under. That's sort of all we have to. It's not. I mean, it's simple, but it's not easy. But it's just, there has to be someone. There has to be some group, some political body actively making good people, which I don't think they are.
No, I would go a bit further than that. I would say that many of our social orders are actually devoted almost, maybe even very, I know, I'll say it, deliberately to selecting the most capable of the worst of us and propelling them to positions of power, authority, and wealth. But
I think the they're they want to make natural slaves, like as many as possible, just a mass of a hive. Maybe that worked with democracy in just manipulating masses of people, but I don't feel like that can continue for very long. Um, I'm starting to think all of the things like democracy and what we considered the West for quite a while, they're going through transformations, some more violent than others, and I'd like to make it as smooth as possible.
wouldn't we all? Some degree of smoothness, and this would definitely be appreciated. So I want to come back to this question of the individual because this is a fascinating question to me. I think that we are in a moment of transformation in terms of the way that we conceive of individuality. And I think that a lot of it has to do with understanding the sort of thing that you're talking about, the kind of dependency of the individual on any number of factors that are completely outside of individual control. Um, our existence within, let's say, a web or an array of influences that we can't abstract ourselves from, right? We're born to certain parents in a certain social context, and all of that has an enormous impact on our lives. I mean, you went very far with that. I think you suggested that that is our life almost. I'm not sure that you gave much room for anything beyond that. I'm curious if you would. Are we just the sum of the influences? Are we just the sum of the influences surrounding us? I guess is the way that I could ask it.
Well, I think more your conditions are a sum of you. Uh, your conditions show you who you are in because I see the world more as a projection in a mind than a thing on like a board, like in a.
Hmm.
I don't see all things are one substance in my view. So we're essentially in a training model. That's what it feels like, not to use such like it's not a digital like programmed
Right, right.
from on high, but a self trainer. Just a it's like looking in the mirror forever. That seems to be what it is.
Yeah, I'm probably not the only person who heard that would feel some sympathy to that particular way of describing our condition here. But um, so that's very interesting. So you turned that on its head in a way that I'd like to hear more about. What was it that you said exactly? You put this in a very interesting way about our conditions being rather than must be some of our conditions. The conditions are kind of like the reflection of us or something like that.
Yeah, they're like our projection. We're seeing
Project.
our well. if you take the totality of your experience, that is your soul. That is what it is. It's not you are a little mote which is floating through this out there experience. You are introspecting the universe.
Right.
Like there is no outside. It's not quite platonic or whatever, but if you understand there is one be or you have some semblance of the one or the ultimate or whatever you call God or whatever, we're either a creation of or within that thing. It's just like a dream. When you're dreaming, there's nothing that isn't you. It's a very similar thing to that, except within this meta dream in which we're all playing. We are all parts of this thing that created that dreamed us up. But we have enough agency. We have enough similarity to the meta dreamer that we are granted the boundary of a being. We are close enough in like an octave resonance to the ultimate that we can exist. We can have a pointed experience. I'm not sure if other animals or plants or stones or anything have this. They probably do not have consciousness in the same way that we do of self-awareness.
That
They
seems fair.
most likely they most likely have consciousness acting upon it, like it's their dream stuff. They're almost like matter, but they do not have a self-organizing principle in the same way that we do.
Right, like a self-organizing principle on the level of consciousness, you mean? Because they evidently have one on the organic scale and the biological scale, but we seem to have this other level of self-organizing, which I think in the last analysis, that's the only way that you can make sense of the idea of freedom. I don't think that freedom actually, as a word, like freedom of the will, means anything if we're not referring to that. So I definitely see the force of what you're saying. There's kind of a paradox, though, in it, isn't there? Because, I mean, you suggested that we have to stop looking so closely at the individual as kind of this floating atomized being who's just sort of out there bumping into things, and more on the level of ecosystems is the word that you used. And that suggests that we can have some degree of control over the influences that control us. Right, there's a way in which there's kind of this attempt to escape, right, to always to get out of our situation. And I think that's kind of a human urge. I think that we've tried to do that in many different ways. I'm suspicious of the scientific endeavor's ability to do that. I think philosophy is probably a better vessel for that. But I'm curious what you think.
Uh, well, I think even in physics, it may not be completely mainstream, but we're moving toward understanding that this is imaginary. That like this isn't like a physical model in the like we're running out of string theory and quantum physics. We're running out. There's no more room there. And then once we stop preserving this dead system and we start actually seeing what's there, trying to understand what's actually there, I think we'll come to understand that this is imaginary, but that doesn't make it less real. And then it gets very confusing because you have all these assumptions and things you were taught about what real means. Like when you
Right,
when you go to sleep and you dream, that's not real.
right, right, right.
All of these levels of realness can be very confusing.
Not to say bewildering and terrifying, yeah, but anyway.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. You get to some states which are that to the extreme, and then it's like religious visions, and then you come back and you have to incorporate what you just experienced. And I think if people did that more, it would probably be better if they were able to like be flung out to the far reaches of the universe and then come back to themselves. You very rapidly forget your problems. There's nothing, there's no importance to them. It's a very, you can just tune out your problems and focus on the joys if you've been blown apart.
I would be tempted to say that there's kind of a precondition to that, though, that you already are willing to not take your problems quite as seriously, maybe as other people do. I don't know. I mean, obviously, there's a way in which that kind of experience puts everything into perspective, right? You come back down from that, and suddenly things really are just put into focus, and you didn't see them adequately before. But I think that if you are really just totally immersed in the problematic nature of like your material immediate existence, it's very difficult to have experiences like that if you don't resort to things like drug use or have some kind of traumatic event to your cranium which provokes that sort of a thing. But um, you kind of have to have, I don't know, you have to have a pre how can I put this? You have to an openness to it, or a willingness to actually experience that on some level of your being before you can actually get there, right?
Yeah, there are a lot of prerequisites to seeing the turning inside out, basically. Um, that's what all the experiences seem to be, regardless of how you attain them. It's like you just turn inside out, and then you come back, and you get to think about what just happened.
Inadequately, moreover.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, it's like you're seeing something new, and you're just thinking about it, and you're trying to figure it out. I think essentially this is what death is. Death is this. It is a mandatory experience of turning inside out. Uh, I, I'm not sure if like there's all these stories of people who become immortal or whatever. Maybe they're constantly inside out and they don't need to ever disappear anymore. But I don't know. Those are just mystical Taoist things.
Yeah, all of that seems to be a kind of mixture of conjecture and then what we're working on based on hearsay, right? Things that we've heard. And again, we're trying to interpret this in ways that we can't. I mean, it's like you're trying to take somebody's description of a reality that you can't comprehend because you've never seen it and turn that into something you can comprehend. So there's necessarily a great deal of loss there.
I mean, they're just fun. They're funny. They're amusing. They're not people who latch onto them. They haven't done the work yet. They
Yeah.
haven't. I don't think they they're not a polished stone. Things stick to them. They get too attached. You have to cultivate some level of indifference to magic, or you also just get overwhelmed. It's like being in love or something. You cannot stop worshiping it, and you
Indeed.
have to stop.
Yeah.
You have to pull back a little bit.
Yeah, how can you do that though? I mean, this is another sort of a paradox, right? Because maybe the paradox of kind of mystical experience, because on the one hand, you're attempting to move in that direction, but you can't be doing so too directly, right? You can't be pushing in that direction deliberately in a goal-oriented way because you'll never get there. I mean, the closest again you can get is drug use, and that's just not going to do it for you. It's going to open up windows that you can't really see through.
Well, I think a lot of the traditions that had this, they have like to start out, you do lots of physical labor and you meditate. So
Right.
you're training your body and your nervous system. You're giving your you're keeping your body healthy so it's not in pain and or well, you're coming to understand pain so it doesn't irritate you quite as much. And then you're sitting still and you're just turning everything off. Uh, and then, in some schools, it's just like if you move your itch or something, you get hit with a stick. And it's just like, stop doing that. And you're just training the body and the mind to be indifferent, to just like, it's not a bad indifference, like a coldness. It's just like an equanimity. You're okay with how things are. It doesn't need to be colder or hotter. And if you're able to you don't have to just sit. Sitting meditation is like the beginning of it because once you can take that into actions, that's another step. But to just be able to taste stillness at all is almost impossible for everyone.
Right.
Uh, I mean, I knew it was for me coming out of, I don't know, when I was 14, 15 maybe. I realized I just cannot focus on things. It's just so difficult.
Yeah.
So I
Experience.
tried figuring that out and I got into meditation, whatever else, just just sitting still and just focusing on like a candle or like the blackness behind your eyes for like an hour. That's impossible.
Is
Uh,
torture. Yeah, torture.
yeah,
But yeah.
but if you do it, suddenly you can read for hours. You can do stuff with a level of focus you just did not have. And like if I was taught that early in school, like if you do this every morning, you will be able to focus and remember things more clearly than anyone else around you. That would have just been it would like simulate a 10, 20 IQ increase just by being able to do that.
That's a useful segue into the question of education. I know that this is something that concerns you very, very much. So, just to start with this, when you talk about education, what are you talking about precisely? Are you talking about the institution of education? Are you talking about some other thing that stands outside that institution? What exactly do you have in mind?
Sort of like training. It's just training, basically. I'm not trying to tell you anything other than how to learn things. Like, it's not a. I understand there is some importance in some specializations where you have to take. Like, if you want to become a surgeon, you watch a surgeon. You look at you do what they're doing. Same for a carpenter. It's just trades essentially. That's all we do. We're just watching another human do something, but we've blown it out into we've somehow disconnected skills from people, and we've placed them in books that I don't know. It feels like a very strung along process now. I don't know. It feels very we're interchangeable mechanical parts, and that's not right. That we shouldn't do that.
Right.
We need to change education away from what it's been toward more of a not quite a dojo or a martial arts type thing, but it does carry over some of that cultivation
Like a
toward
discipline.
you're around yeah, you're around people who know what you want to do, and they can just embody you can embody your future self if you want to do that. Of course, for general education, it's not so specialized. So, like for just training, being cultural exemplars are what teachers should be. They're role models. That's what a teacher is. If if you're doing anything else, you're not good enough to be an educator. And that's sort of how I see it. So I don't want when I speak of education, I don't want a formal school. What may end up there. The most important thing is the people and idea transfer.
Mm-hmm.
That's all that matters. It doesn't matter how that happens, whether it's over the internet, whether you're reading, whether you're physically with someone watching them work.
So one of the difficulties with institutional education is that it's always bound up very, very closely with the kind of moving values of a society or a social order, right? And as of late, those values have tended toward materialism. They've tended toward interest in kind of political and worldly power, and so our education system has been bound up very integrally with our economy, of kind of preparing people to be those moving parts within the greater economic machine. And I think that one of the really promising things about where we are right now is that that model is failing altogether because our economy is coming apart at the seams and will do so probably with greater rapidity in time to come.
You know,
I don't think that things can maintain the kind of order that we have, I mean, that you and I lived with for practically our entire lives. And this is for better and for worse. But one of the ways in which it might be for better is that that old economic model of education just doesn't make sense anymore. I mean, going to university in order to get specialized, in order to find a job, that doesn't quite pan out. I mean, that, even when I was going through university back in the early 2000s, right, this wasn't really working out the way that it had in prior decades. And that opens up possibilities, doesn't it? I mean, that opens up possibilities for new kinds of education, for independent kinds of education, for forms of education that are not so rigorously trained upon the goal of productivity, for example, and things like that. So, I mean, I think that that makes for a very interesting historical moment for the meaning of education, and this might also play as well into what we were saying before about artificial intelligence opening up the possibility of looking at different aspects of our capacity as human beings. I think that that might definitely play a role here. How do you see that playing out?
I think we should split preparatory education, like up to high school. Not sure when kids should start school or how that should work and when it should end.
Mm-hmm.
But that foundational, more of that should be done by the family, the direct family. Um, if you get rid of a lot of worthless jobs, because a lot of jobs are worthless, people have much more time with their children. Um,
Right.
People have, well, that's scary. A lot of people, I think a lot of people don't want to be around their kids because they don't want to give, they don't want to, they might frame it as their kids are annoying or something, but I think they're very afraid of giving themselves to their kids. Like they don't want them to catch their personalities. But that's a learning experience in itself. You're having to face that, your own traumas in order, because I think that's what seeing a little kid does, especially if it's yours. You're seeing how to be better through them not having,
Definitely.
through
Definitely.
them not being programmed yet. You're seeing all your programming, and you have to think very quickly. Um,
Right. Right.
so I think that just there'll have to be overlays onto this, but just giving adults time with their children will forcibly, naturally educate both parties in a way that I think will be beneficial. And then you would have to have some, you'd likely have some communal effort of those parents would actually become invested in understanding things if they had, like, if they were the educators for, let's say until they're 15, 16 or something, maybe. We'd have to have entirely different social phenomena. Just like, where would they go to interact with kids their own age? Would people just be going between people's houses? Would we lose like primary education schools? Would those become something else? Uh, what I'd seen is maybe those places become centers of learning in a much more open sense. You're not on a bell schedule. You're not you don't have to go there at the same time and get the same cookie cutter education as everyone else. It's much more like a library which people work at. Like you go to a place that is full of those exemplary cultural figures that I talked about. Those teachers, those professors, those whatever. It's almost like a religious type community. That's what a culture is. You have the pillars of the community just in a space, and then they have their own homes and their whatever. It's a place that anyone can go to and be immersed in something admirable. I think it would have to be thought about a lot more and formalized, and a lot of things with the economy have to be taken into consideration because I don't know where the economy is going right now. I don't
Nobody.
know if we're yeah, I don't know what kind of money we're going to have in 20 years. Um,
Right. Right.
I've seen things about maybe it being your computational ability, like through, like people have talked about, instead of universal basic income, I think it was Nick Land, but universal basic income, universal compute, which is just everyone is allotted a percentage of computational ability, and then they can invest that into whatever, and that is their I don't know, starter points. But there was another one which was measuring basically perceived caloric
Yeah. Yeah.
production, which I think that could be, but then that doesn't make sense because if you have a higher IQ, you actually use less calories. So we'd have to go through lots of trials,
Right.
which I think is good. We shouldn't. People are so quick to jump on something because they want to get the points for having done the thing, but they don't really care how good the thing is. It's just it's that social urge to get points. It's very
Very powerful.
it's powerful, and it gets in the way of everything.
Yeah, it does. Yeah. Yeah.
But then after that preliminary education, where you're just learning how to be a human around good humans, then you'd have specialized education. And because I don't think, like, unless you're extremely autistic and you must become a physicist or something when you're 5 years old, you're not, you have other skills to work on
Right.
first, like to even be able to think clearly in a class or around other people. You have social anxieties, you have all these things. And then if you were polished in all of those internal elements when you got directed into a specialization, you'd be able to make long-term decisions in a way that, or holistic decisions, not just long-term, but decisions which actually improve the field, improve yourself while you're doing them. Um, you're not cutting any corners just to get a degree, and you hate it, but you want the money. Um, all of these things. So I think that preliminary education of learning how to be a human to replace K-12, followed by a specialized career. Um, I don't think I don't think school that specialization should be separate from your career. There's no there's no reason why that should be the case. If you have a company and you have someone who does a job well, when they become unable to do the job, or they want to transition to a manager type role or a coach type role, then they just train the next people. And that the prerequisite work that you're taught just by reading textbooks basically in college, AI will just do that. You
Yeah,
don't
right.
you don't you don't need. I mean, even I just did that myself just by looking for it. If you have a robot dog that digs up all these things for you and gives them to you, you don't need middling professors at all.
Right, right, right. Yeah, and again, that mid range gets cut right out.
I think that's good though. I don't think it's economically perhaps bad, but
I guess there are different ways of addressing the question of whether it's good, and it depends kind of on what perspective you're looking from, right? There are ways in which it has benefits on the social scale and in terms of just human thriving and human betterment. Potentially could have. I'm not convinced it will necessarily, but I'm hoping. But obviously, from the perspective of people who are in that mid range and end up losing their jobs over it, it doesn't quite have that same that same feel to it, does it?
well, a lot of people don't like their job either.
This
So
is
I mean,
also
there are many who might like their job, but maybe they just like it sort of, and they're just repressing that they really wanted to do something else, but it wasn't economically profitable. If you're able to if you're able to connect the economy to value, and actually, then people will be doing what they want because we know that people who are doing what they want perform better.
right, but that connection is kind of tenuous at present, at best, in many cases, right? That connection between
Yes.
value and and economy. The economy moves on the basis of other things in many sectors of human endeavor,
Well,
and so
we have a zero sum game, but that 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 makes everyone greedy. They think they think they'll run out, and I just think that's a materialist mind. If you're not a materialist, you can't really think that things run out because the stuff which things are made of is immaterial.
well, it's the point system again, isn't it? It's a point system in terms
Yeah,
of dollars, right? And how many points can I get?
yeah, yeah. It's the big sport, the big game, the meta game.
Right, right, exactly. I mean, to say the least that could be said, we're definitely at a moment of extreme transition. Things are going to be changing radically very fast, and we're not quite sure where we're going to end up in the future. And this opens up kind of like a twin possibility, right? On the one hand, there's kind of a temptation to try to establish greater levels of centralized authority or control. They can come down and force order on an inherently chaotic situation and try to make sure that things turn out all right by directing things very carefully, which doesn't necessarily and doesn't always in general doesn't work, right? When you try to establish that kind of almost tyrannical control over something which is coming apart, it ends up just very very bad situations emerge from that. On the other hand, there's this sort of opening up of a spontaneous or more organic development from underneath. And I mean, when I'm listening to you talk about education, it seems to me that some of the forerunners here are people who are involved in homeschooling, for example, or people who are breaking away from the university system to try to pursue other means of education or try to open other means of education. Um, the creator economy, the so-called creator economy, is very much bound up in this as well. and it's very chaotic. It's very sloppy. There are a lot of real rough edges to it right now, and there's kind of a temptation, I think, perhaps to try to let's get in there and order this and organize this so that it's not quite so sloppy. But at the same time, you're sort of as well losing its dynamism and its potentiality when you're doing that, right? You're kind of it might even be kind of like correlated to what we were talking about before with these two kinds of human intelligence. You're trying to be too geometrical and mathematical about it, and you're trying to squeeze it to the point that all the meaning flies out. Um, so, I mean, you seem to be taking an approach which is perhaps in the middle of these two in some way. I'm curious to hear more about that.
I'm trying to take the middle. Uh,
Not easy,
I
definitely.
found I find the middle through being torn between two extremes, and then you're just having a dialogue between these two voices in your head.
Yeah, right,
Um, and then you're able to look back on it and you're like, oh, okay, the middle, like I can appease both these voices if I do this thing.
right, right.
Well, we need to order it, but it's order more like a Zen garden. It's not so. There's an aesthetic beauty to nature that we don't, we can't replicate in that same way. We just let it, you let it go, you let it do what it's doing, but you provide it something. You trim it here and there, you help it along, but you're not putting roses into like rows. That's a very strange way to do things. You're not putting humans into rows. I mean, we are, but you shouldn't be
Right.
because it's a very unnatural bug man experience. Uh, I feel like just by putting people into these, it becomes chaotically ordered. It's like it's breaking universal laws of like function
Hmm.
just by putting things in what we think of as order. Um, those people who are trying to order things just generally can't handle natural complexity, and they're trying to crush it into a straight line
Right.
because curves actually make them go insane. They just cannot handle bright colors. It's a very it's like an autism. I think it's some sort of like autism. You can't handle bright lights, colors, sound. That refine it, make it all grayscale. Um, and I don't think we can't do it like that. We need to again. It always comes back to the people. We need people who are leaders, and that means they need charisma, which I don't think a lot of politicians have. They can have stage charisma, maybe.
Not even so much anymore, right? We've even lost kind of the charisma they used to have. I mean, even like the pseudo charisma of a Bill Clinton, that sort of a thing just doesn't come up anymore. Or Obama perhaps had a bit, but anyway.
That's one of the things I'd hope to like train. Not a manipulative charisma, but there will just always be people who other people gravitate around, and those people need to be focused on and taught how to use this well, or they'll turn the cogs into like a meat grinder, and that's not. That's how a lot of things get now. If you understand the social machine as a living organism, more like cells moving around each other in a like your cells aren't rusting in the same way that a machine is. You have every element of self-preservation within you usually, unless extreme cases. But the political body, the larger selves work like this too. Um, so like yourself, your family, your community, your nation, all these things, they function on a harmonic scale of basically the same patterns. If you're able to figure yourself out and order yourself, you'll find that everything that you everything that you do, I mean, if you get deep into it, you actually become wise through self mastery. Uh, you're not just pompous about it. You'll find that those skills translate to every arena outside of yourself. Um, so just like ordering your thoughts, you're not killing and crushing your ideas. You're giving them their space. You're figuring out what to do so that bad thoughts don't come up or whatever. You're not, you know, you're actually taking care of yourself, and then you get good at that, and then you can move on to your family, and then you can get good at that, and then you can move on to your whatever extensions of self, eventually to the whole planet. I'm not sure how this will work. I've thought about globalism, and what is the middle way with that between nationalism and globalism seems to be, and I don't know if it'll happen or if it's good or not, but what I keep saying is like a central monarch or aristocracy with nation states of with their own, rule of law basically, but they're all essentially the same in spirit, whether they dress themselves. It doesn't matter how they dress themselves. So you have like a universal agreement on first principles, but then pretty much everything else you can have different. It doesn't matter that much. You can have cultural differences as long as you're able to find the universal constants, which there are. There are patterns to the human, the world, reality, which are constant between all people. And if you're able to make agreements based on that, then it very quickly lubricates the rest of it.
The difficulty is in getting there, isn't it? Particularly because we have a system right now in which I believe there is some degree of agreement between the people who are really pulling the strings, the people who have the money and the power. There's some degree of agreement about the way the world should be, but it's kind of on the basis of corrupt or limited principles rather than those universal ones that you were discussing. So the question of how to turn that around is very, very tricky one, and it seems like it kind of demands a shift in the foundations rather than a shift in the head. Right? It's you can't start building the thing from the top down because you'll end up just building in the sky. And right now, what's demanded more than anything else, I think, is that undergirding, which can actually establish the possibilities for something that's more promising or that has a brighter future to it than much of what's presently happening. And so, I mean, it comes down, I think, the question of education is central here. And the question, I think, above all, of like how to teach people how to be like good human beings, right? That seems to be really, really important. And how do you do that? When you were talking about that, the Platonic dialogue, the Meno came into mind. Where there's this discussion: can you teach virtue? And throughout the dialogue, it kind of goes back and forth between Socrates and this figure Meno. But I think that what comes out of the dialogue are a few things. First of all, it comes out that the philosophical method, right, trying to train people how to just think through problems like that, actually is a training toward virtue. You are training people to be more humane and to be more open to the views of other individuals that disagree with you, and to be less polemical and to be less warlike. And so there's a way in which you cannot teach virtue in terms of principles necessarily, particularly the people who've already like grown, they've already been formed in some way, the majority of human beings. But you can teach virtue if you can teach them to be more philosophical. On the other hand, Socrates is dialoguing with Meno, and if I remember correctly, Meno goes on to end up like being involved in some kind of tyrannical coup in Athens. And so there's the suggestion there that Plato's kind of suggesting, you can do this, but there are limits, right? You can't do this with everybody. So it's a very complicated situation. But I mean, I think that, and this might be where the individual comes more onto the stage, right? How can we deal with this in a kind of, maybe not the individual, that's the wrong word, because individual is a very modern word. It has all kinds of baggage, but how we deal with one another, right? The way in which we try to interact with one another and the way that we try to dialogue with one another and to get a grip on the world around us together, right? I think that goes a long way. I'm not sure if it goes far enough, but
I think virtue is best embodied than it is taught. Uh,
indeed.
I mean, you can catalog the actions of a virtuous person, but you can't tell someone how to do it. Uh, it's sort of like it's very much the same as like enlightenment, talking about people who are enlightened in the East. I think it's essentially the same thing as virtue, um, just becoming self-aware and acting with authenticity. If you're able to actually do that, you are generally virtuous. I mean, I'm not even sure if when people do bad things, I mean, some of them, there are some in some ways virtuous villains, in that that is actually who they are. Maybe they will through this develop further, and they will like that's actually what they had to do. But as for societal control, the issue we tend to have with societal control is that we think, or no, lawmakers tend to think everyone will just become this evil without a firm hand over them. And it seems now that the forces that be are intentionally like stirring that, like they're trying to make it look like we need a dictatorship over the rowdy
Right.
the group.
Like Batman, but Batman is king, right? Just kind of a terrifying idea. Yeah.
Yeah, but there's no deep comprehension of self and other humans. Like there's a deep lack of foundational knowledge from people in power, and it's not a natural system. It's not an organic system. When I think about it, I'm not even sure how the political sphere works. Like actually, because none of it makes any sense at all. There's no logical pattern other than there's no natural pattern to it. It seems to be people are cast into roles by a higher force,
Right.
which are placed there. There's not always a behind the scenes with the illusion of natural occurrence, and this makes people crazy because they know that it's not possible. There's no way that person is above me,
Right.
basically.
Right.
Um, if you destabilize the hierarchy like that, it just everyone gets tense. So to that degree, we do have to do some top down, but it isn't top down control of the people. It's top control of the top. Like they need to regulate themselves.
Yeah, but how
But
do you get to that? I think is the real question, right? Because that's kind of suggests that you have to have a top over the top, and that gets really revolutionary, which never works out well. So, I mean, where how exactly how do we manage that?
it'll probably be a slow grind uh, of a lot of different things. But I feel like there will probably be some super dictator like there's always someone trying to do that. I don't know. Maybe such a person will occur, or not just a person. It can be a group. It doesn't matter how large the body is, but a body of people sort of popularly declared to not go on a murderous spree among all the politicians, but just to an actual regulatory body of virtue, value, whatever else. I mean, I don't know why it always devolves into thoughts of like murderous gulags or whatever. You can just imprison people if they're wrong, like if they're bad. You don't have to torture their 9 generations.
Here's the trouble, though. That's easy if you have the power to begin with, but if you don't have the power to begin with, how do you get it? Right. That's the right.
Well, I think America's weird because we are there's like a there's like two militaries. There's the population, and then there's the
Right.
military.
Right.
Um, which, if we were to have some sort of civil war, it would probably be those two factions, and then there'd be a mixing because a lot of people would leave one to join the other. But
Right. Right.
those would be the bodies which make up it. I've always sort of felt that physical conflict is the failure of previous layers of defense. That seems to just be that's just how I've thought of things. Uh, but with what is it, fifth generation warfare or whatever, it feels like everyone is a combatant in intellectual warfare right now. No one is spared. everyone is has a has a mental gun to their head. It's just
Right.
this. I think we have to work on that area to just free up the mind before we start doing, like, we have to do that rapidly before the possibility of physical altercations comes about, and we seem to be running out of time in that regard.
We do.
I'm hopeful that we can speed things along, but education requires thinking in generational time spans. If you don't also have immediate action, you're not going to have generations. Like, you're going to restart the cycle, and then it'll just be a ground up thing again. There's the whole societal collapse, the collapse of complex societies. I'm not sure if that will happen. We can still correct that, but we will continue to experience the negative effects of that, including drug use, suicide, violence, all these other things, just because we're not preparing humans to understand the world. So they get lost, and then they lash out. They have this primal thing take over them, um, which is what happens when you're not given basically when you don't have the safety to turn off those primal limbic instincts. And it seems to be those who are in charge are just irritating those limbic instincts as much as they can. And I don't really know how to. We've done a good job in getting away from television and, like, forms of media which their sole purpose is government propaganda to destroy nations from the inside out. But they're in the internet too now. They've caught up. It's all around us. And I don't know what their motives are or why this keeps happening, but we have to be training warriors in that field to just sort of
Yeah. Yeah.
manage it.
Yeah, I agree entirely. I mean, the real complexity right now is that you have a situation where people are not as well prepared to kind of understand reality as they used to be just by their own lights, because the education system has been failing for a long time, probably deliberately so in many cases. And at the same time, the natural fallback for that, which is to say authorities, right, to pay attention to authorities, well, those authorities are crumbling before our very eyes. I mean, you talked about the situation in our supposedly transparent democracies, and they're so little transparent that we don't even know how little transparent they are. We can't even gauge how much goes on in the shadows. Um, so people sense that. And so, on the one hand, they're stepping away from the authorities that could probably give them some kind of guidance or a center of gravity, at least in times like these, because those authorities just don't have the moral authority that they should have. And on the other hand, they're not really capable of working through these problems by their own intelligences because they haven't been trained in that way. So it's a really kind of an interesting moment in which a lot of things are sort of coalescing in a way that could be very volatile. But on the other hand, I mean, I think that there's some potential and there's some promise in seeing how many individuals are kind of coming to awareness of this and the ways in which they're kind of responding to it, yourself included, Darian. I mean, the way that you are going about attempting to give people the means to try to orient themselves in this imminent disaster. I think that's of utmost importance, and it's the only thing that's capable of keeping us afloat in the times to come. Because when the disorder really begins and the systems that we've known for so many decades really start to fall apart at the periphery, and that periphery moves toward the center, that could make for desperate and crazy times. And the more that we can avoid that, I think the better, right? The more that we can try and hold the center.
There's a problem in even making new institutions, because those become rapidly infiltrated in ways that everything has to be a social network, in that it has to be people. They cannot be like doctrines. It has to be like a living body of people you respect and understand, who are honest, and they actually want to help people. That's not too uncommon. It's just so hard to organize them into like, it's not even like a military action type of thing. It's just more like educators for the most part. If it gets large enough, I don't know. I don't maybe large maybe like the state or something will try to disrupt it, and that would require that body to defend itself in some way. But the people in charge, the people who hold the most respect in those communities have to constantly be vetting the people that are coming. It has to be an exclusive group, because you can't be having like CIA people come in or whatever and then become part of your board. That just
Right.
won't work. You'd probably have to slowly start building an alternative economy and an alternative system in every way. But then if it gets large enough, there will probably be some sort of government action. I'm not even the United States government seems so dysregulated and have so many groups vying for power. I don't even know if they'd have the wherewithal to act on it or know. Like, I'm not sure if they're even aware of recognizing virtue as a threat. They're so far away from authentic goodness that they don't know what it can do. It's like a it's like a cartoon almost. Like they're so far off in their dark evil castle of game playing and subterfuge and all that that they don't even see the little like Hobbit Shire as a threat. I mean that's an optimistic view.
It's a weirdly optimistic view, right? Things are so bad at that level that it opens up the possibility for some goodness underneath.
Well, if you become like an evil person, you can't see light anymore. Like you've shielded
Right.
yourself away from because if you were able to see it still, it would still like it would draw you into it. That's just sort of how it works. Most people can't see good and not be drawn into it. Um, very
Right.
few, very few have built up like a suit of hate armor where they can no longer perceive any of the good, and those people probably need to be like re-educated, like actually like put into a that would be what prison is for, but you're actually giving them means of like you allow them to be an autodidact in prison if they want to. If they don't want to, then whatever, they can do whatever else. But that's another thing. Prisons should not be places where you get worse.
Yes.
Uh,
Yes.
and I think that you can't have prisons run by prisoners. You cannot put you can put good men in charge of prisons who understand evil, but you can't put evil people there just to keep them at bay. Like there may be short term work. You're keeping all the bad people together, even if the people at the top and bottom are both evil. Uh, but you have to start just like basically we could try running that prerequisite education that I was talking about on prisoners. Like actually just you're giving them safety. They're not afraid of being raped or shanked or anything.
Sure.
They're allowed to they're allowed to work out, they can read, they can do whatever, they can learn about whatever.
And you're also having the benefit in that case of seeing how this would work on some of the toughest cases imaginable. So,
You could use like experimental methods with them and then you start, after you've done the beta test of prisoner, you can start doing it with innocent children and just let them, you know, because prisoners are probably, or the potential candidates for imprisonment are probably the most programmed people there are. You'd probably have to run them through severe like cultural detoxes.
hmm,
Um, I'm not sure how this would work, microdosing psychedelics, doing anything to regain their neuroplasticity, make them as children again, and then just attempting to give them basically water and sunlight. That's sort of
well, Darian, this has been a fascinating conversation. I've enjoyed this immensely. This is my favorite kind of conversation because it's sort of fractal. You feel like you could take any part of it and turn that little piece into a whole 1.5 hour conversation itself, and that's just wonderful. So we'll have to do this again sometime if you're up for it. I would very much enjoy it.
yeah, sure. I enjoyed it as
Excellent.
well.
Darian, before we come to a close here, please tell everyone where they can find you, what you're working on, anything you'd like to share along those lines.
You can find me on basically just Substack. I think it's just Royal Fool. Probably put a link in the description.
I will have a link in the description to that. I'll put a link in as well to your X profile.
Okay. Yeah, on X I'm a little bit more meming, but yeah, it's
Okay,
if you want my
very good.
serious work, then Substack. Yeah.
Excellent. Okay, very good. Yeah, and I recommend it to everyone who's watching. So, Darian, thanks again. Thank you so much for joining me. Thank you for this conversation. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
All right. So, thank you all as well for joining us. And until next time, farewell to all.